He was 21 years old, a rising political leader, a father-to-be, and the U.S. government decided that he was too dangerous to live. On December 4th, 1969, in Chicago, Illinois, a pre-dawn police raid shattered the quiet of a West Side apartment. Officers stormed inside and unleashed 99 shots. One bullet was fired by the Panthers. When it was over, Fred Hampton lay dead in his bed. Authorities called it a shootout. Survivors called it an execution. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught, the podcast where we examine the lives, behavior, and psychology behind the most extreme acts of violence, and what happens when the truth finally catches up. This week, we're talking about Fred Hampton. He wasn't just another activist. As the chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, he was building something radical. Not only resistance to police brutality, but multiracial working-class unity. And that kind of coalition drew the attention of the FBI and its secret counterintelligence program. This story isn't just about one deadly raid, it's about government surveillance, race, power, and state violence. It's about what happens when political movements are labeled threats, and the lasting legacy of political repression within America. Fred Hampton was born in 1948 in Maywood, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. From an early age, he stood out. Teachers and classmates described him as sharp, disciplined, and fearless when it came to speaking his mind. By his teens, Hampton wasn't just participating in student activities, he was organizing them. He had a natural ability to command a room, blending his charisma with a deep understanding of both history and politics. Before he ever joined the Black Panther Party, Hampton served as the president of the local NAACP Youth Council. Under his leadership, membership reportedly grew into the hundreds, and he pushed for better recreational facilities and resources for Black youth in his community. Even then, he showed a pattern that would define his life, organizing at the grassroots level and demanding structural change, not symbolic reform. When Hampton joined the Black Panther Party, his rise was very rapid. He became chairman of the Illinois chapter at just 21 years old. He was named deputy chairman of the national organization. But his leadership wasn't only rhetorical, it was practical. He helped expand the Panthers' free breakfast program, feeding children before school at a time when food insecurity was widespread. He supported community health clinics that offered basic medical care. He prioritized political education classes and organized against police brutality in Chicago, within neighborhoods where tensions with law enforcement were constant and often violent. Perhaps his most groundbreaking effort was the formation of what he called the Rainbow Coalition, an alliance between the Panthers, the Young Lords, and the Young Patriots organization. This coalition united Black, Puerto Rican, and poor white communities around shared economic struggles rather than racial division. That multiracial, class-based solidarity is precisely what made Hampton so powerful and, to many within our government, so threatening. He wasn't just criticizing the system. He was building relationships across racial lines among working-class people. A united coalition of poor and marginalized communities had the potential to disrupt entrenched political and economic power structures. The question becomes, was Hampton targeted because he was radical or because he was effective? Now, the assassination of Fred Hampton didn't happen in a vacuum. Unfolding during one of the most volatile decades in modern American history, the 1960s were defined by mass movements, political upheaval, a deep crisis of legitimacy within the United States government. The civil rights movement had already transformed the country. From sit-ins to freedom rides to the March on Washington, activists forced the nation to confront segregation and racial terror. But legislative victories like the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act did not end systemic inequality. Frustrations over housing discrimination, economic injustice, and police brutality continued to grow, especially in northern cities like Chicago. At the same time, the Vietnam War was escalating. Graphic television coverage brought the brutality of the conflict into American living rooms, fueling massive anti-war protests. Young people were marching, resisting the draft, and questioning the morality of U.S. foreign policy. Trust in government institutions was eroding. Urban uprisings erupted across the country in response to police violence and entrenched poverty, from Watts in 1965 to Detroit and Newark in 1967. These rebellions were often framed as riots, but many participants described them as reactions to years of systemic neglect and abuse. It actually reminds me very much of the Mike Brown shooting. I don't know if, I guess it was already over 10 years ago. It's crazy. I didn't even think about that. But for people who don't know, Mike Brown was an 18-year-old who was shot and killed by a police officer named Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri. It was August 9th, 2014. And the resulting riots that came from his death were not just because he was killed, but because within Ferguson, Missouri, there had been a history of systemic inequality. Essentially, the police department were using the citizens of Ferguson as a way to boost the money that the police department was getting. Now, for most police departments in the United States, you get your money based on taxing the people within your community. The problem is Ferguson is a community, Ferguson, Missouri, a suburb of St. Louis, that struggles financially. And so they guess they felt that they weren't getting enough money. So they were doing things that were bordering illegal, but kind of technically still legal. Essentially, they were creating like debtors' prisons, which is something that's been banned within the United States for decades. And they were doing it through aggressively ticketing people, and then they would take their cars, and it was just this whole situation that had stacked on top of themselves so aggressively that by the time the shooting happened August 9th, the people of Ferguson were already primed to be upset. And that's the same thing that was happening in the States in the 60s. Riots, as they were being called, like Watts in 1965 and in Newark in 1967, these were a response to years of systemic neglect from their police and from within their local government. Now you have all that going on, but then you have to layer onto this tension are the assassinations of the two most prominent Black leaders in the country at the time. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965, and Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. These deaths deepened both the grief and radicalization within the Black community. Many activists began to question whether nonviolence alone could protect them or bring about any meaningful change. And then, amidst this unrest, the federal government intensified its surveillance operations. The FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, expanded its focus on Black nationalist organizations specifically. It was officially designed to monitor subversive threats, but they 100% focused on engaging in infiltration, psychological warfare, disinformation campaigns, and efforts to sow internal conflict, specifically in organizations that were projecting Black excellence and trying to put Black people in a better position in this country, which means we were being directly sabotaged by our own government. And a lot of people know this, but this all happened under FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who did a host of very illegal things. The last time I probably referenced J. Edgar Hoover on this podcast was when I talked about Killers of the Flower Moon, that book about what happened to the indigenous people on the West Coast who owned a lot of gas and natural oil, and how they were slowly being killed within their own community by people within their community, and the US government just didn't seem to care for a while. So we have a history of not liking J. Edgar Hoover on this podcast. And he specifically labeled the Black Panther Party as the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. And there are internal FBI memos that revealed his specific objective to prevent the so-called rise of the Black Messiah who could unify and electrify the movement. In this climate where activism has been equated with subversion and dissent with danger, it's not really a surprise that someone like Fred Hampton was being monitored. He was being viewed as a threat that needed to be neutralized. It's just how they did it was pretty jacked up too. Now, behind the scenes of Fred and his rising influence was a quiet operation already in motion. The FBI had planted an informant inside the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. His name was William O'Neill. And he wasn't just a casual source. He had infiltrated this organization, gained trust, and he was climbing the ranks. And eventually, he became Hampton's personal bodyguard, a position that gave him direct access to meetings, strategies, and Hampton himself. While presenting himself as a loyal Panther, O'Neill was feeding information back to the FBI. But most critically, he provided a detailed floor plan of Fred Hampton's apartment at 2337 West Monroe Street in Chicago. He identified where in the apartment that Hampton slept. He mapped out the entrances and exits, and that intelligence would later shape the trajectory of bullets in the early morning hours of December 4th, 1969. And then came the setup. On the night before the raid, Hampton returned home after teaching a political education class. According to later testimony, he drank from a beverage that had been laced with barbiturates. Multiple survivors reported that Hampton was unusually difficult to wake up the following morning. Some believed that he was intentionally drugged, a claim that has long shadowed this case, though the exact circumstances are still debated. Just before dawn, a heavily armed tactical unit from the Cook County State's Attorney Office, working in coordination with the Chicago Police Department, executed a raid on the apartment. The operation was tied to the COINTELPRO, and the officers burst inside, firing before anyone even knew what happened. Nearly 100 shots were discharged. Ballistic evidence would later suggest that only a single shot came from inside the apartment, which was an accidental firing by Panther Mark Clark as he was being fatally shot. Hampton reportedly remained unconscious and heavily sedated the entire time they were in there. He was found deceased in his bed, and witnesses say that he was shot at very close range. I'm going to go more into the raid, but I want you to ask yourself, would you consider this a police shootout or an execution? Because for me, when an informant supplies the floor plan and then the leader is incapacitated and the raid unfolds with such overwhelming force, even though the organization has not shown this force was needed, I feel like the line between law enforcement action and political elimination becomes very impossible to ignore. But like I said, this was the early morning hours of December 4th, 1969. The police all converge on 2337 West Monroe Street. It's a modest West Side apartment, and members of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party were all asleep. They forced their way in shortly before 5 a.m. Now, authorities would claim they were met with gunfire, that the Panthers shot first, triggering a violent exchange. But forensic analysis and later investigations paint a starkly different picture. Nearly 100 shots were fired during this raid, and ballistics would show that almost all of them came from police weapons. Only a single shot came from within the apartment. And again, they think that's when Panther Mark Clark fell after he got shot, and he reflexively pulled the trigger when he was dying. Now, Fred Hampton lay in a back bedroom, and he was beside his pregnant partner, Akua Najeri, who was known at the time as Deborah Johnson. Survivors reported that Hampton was extremely difficult to wake up. They ran to him and tried to shake him awake. But as the gunfire erupted through the apartment walls, Akua just couldn't wake him up. When the officers entered the bedroom, she later recounted that they pulled her out of the room. She said she heard 2 shots fired after officers stood over Hampton's body. And according to her testimony, one officer remarked that Hampton was barely alive, followed by another person saying, "He'll make it." And then came the final shots. Johnson maintained that Hampton was shot at point blank range while laying in his bed. When it was over, only 2 Panthers were dead, Mark Clark and Fred Hampton. Several others were wounded, and police initially described the scene as a fierce gun battle. But the official account would be challenged with real facts very, very quickly. One fact cut through the political debate. Fred Hampton was only 21 years old. He didn't have a chance to stand up, no opportunity to defend himself in any meaningful way. Weeks after his death, his son, Fred Hampton Jr., was born. And that raid at 2337 West Monroe Street did more than just end a life. It became one of the most controversial police operations in American history, a flashpoint in the ongoing conversation about state power, accountability, and political dissent. In the immediate aftermath of the raid, they quickly tried to control the narrative. Officials described it, again, as a fierce and justified gun battle. Police claimed they had been met with heavy gunfire and were forced to defend themselves. Press conferences emphasized the danger officers already faced. framing this operation as a lawful response to armed militants. But that version of events would unravel almost immediately because members of the Black Panther Party said, "Come on in, guys." And they invited the reporters and community members and other activists into the apartment before it was repaired. And what they saw contradicted the official account. The bullet holes all travel inward from the outside. There are virtually none toward the doorway where the police would have been standing. The walls were riddled with police gunfire, and the physical evidence suggested that it was a barrage directed into the apartment rather than equal crossfire. Independent investigations and later forensic analysis supported this observation. Nearly all of those shots came from police weapons. The idea of a prolonged shootout suddenly looked much less credible. And the families of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, along with other survivors of the raid, began to file civil lawsuits against the city of Chicago, Cook County, and federal officials. What followed was a grueling 13-year legal battle marked by delays, dismissed charges, appeals, and the eventual revelation of prior hidden documents. During the proceedings, evidence surfaced of coordination between local law enforcement and federal authorities through COINTELPRO. Internal memos and records showed that the FBI had not only infiltrated the Panthers, but provided intelligence that directly contributed to the raid. The involvement of the Bureau challenged the narrative that this was just a local political matter. This had nothing to do with the local police, and this all came from the FBI. And then in 1982, without admitting any wrongdoing, the government agreed to pay $1.85 million to the family and survivors. At this time, it was one of the largest civil rights settlements in U.S. history. But the settlement didn't bring criminal convictions. No officer was charged for Hampton's murder. But the civil case forced disclosure of documents that confirmed illegal surveillance and disruption tactics that were carried out under COINTELPRO. The broader implications were profound, and the case exposed how federal and local agencies had collaborated to target a political organization. It revealed the extent to which dissent, particularly Black people organizing, it revealed the extent to which dissent, particularly Black people organizing, was treated as a national security threat. And it cemented the assassination of Fred Hampton not only as a tragic killing, but a defining example of government overreach and political repression in the United States. More than 5 decades after his death, Fred Hampton remains a powerful and polarizing figure in American political memory. For years, his story lived primarily in activist circles, documentaries, and community history. But in 2021, it reached a much wider audience with the release of Judas and the Black Messiah, a dramatization of Hampton's leadership within the Black Panther Party and the betrayal by his FBI informant, William O'Neill. It introduced a new generation to Hampton's speeches, his organizing, and the circumstances of the raid that killed him. The movie sparked renewed public conversation about COINTELPRO, government infiltration, and the extent to which the state viewed Black political movements as internal enemies. For many viewers, it was the first time they encountered Hampton not as a footnote in history, but as a charismatic, strategic, and deeply committed leader. That renewed interest didn't exist in isolation. The film arrived during a period of heightened national reckoning over police violence and racial injustice. Protests following high-profile police killings led to widespread examination of law enforcement, accountability, systemic racism, and the militarization of policing. In that context, Hampton's death felt less like distant history and more like part of an ongoing pattern within this country. Conversations about government surveillance also resurfaced. From digital data tracking to federal monitoring of activist groups, questions about how the state responds to dissent remain relevant. Hampton's targeting under COINTELPRO serves as a historical precedent, a reminder that intelligence agencies have in the past moved beyond surveillance into disruption and elimination, even of people within our own country. His legacy also lives in the language of modern activism. Hampton emphasized coalition building across racial and economic lines, focusing on shared material conditions rather than division. Today, organizers who advocate for multiracial working class solidarity reference similar principles. Perhaps the most enduring piece of his legacy is a quote that continues to circulate widely. "You can kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill the revolution." This line captures why Hampton's story persists. While his life was cut short at just 21, the ideas he championed, community, empowerment, political education, collective resistance, they didn't disappear with him. Instead, they echo through contemporary movements that continue to challenge state power. In that sense, Hampton's cultural impact extends beyond film or historical debate. It lives in the ongoing struggle over who gets to define justice, security, and freedom within America. More than 50 years later, the assassination of Fred Hampton still forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. This was a youth leader. Hampton was just 21, brilliant, disciplined, already building programs that fed children and united communities. And his age matters. It shows just how powerful young voices can be and how threatening those voices are to entrenched systems. This was about state power, not just police at someone's doorstep, but coordinated intelligence operations and narratives shaped before the public could ever see the evidence. Hampton's death forced us to ask, who controls the story and who benefits from that story? This was about fear of a multiracial solidarity. Hampton's Rainbow Coalition wasn't symbolic. It was uniting Black, Puerto Rican, and poor white communities around a shared economic struggle, something we should be doing right now, too. That kind of unity doesn't just challenge policy, it challenges the hierarchy. It disrupts longstanding strategies of dividing working class people. And ultimately, this is about the cost of dissent. Today, that conversation is urgent. Political actions are escalating. Protest is being framed as extremism. And every day, Americans demanding a fairer society are being treated like threats. Hampton's story is a warning. When they equate our organization with danger, our lives are at stake. I worry that if we don't learn from this history, we may see more Fred Hamptons in our future. The answer isn't division, it is unity. What Hampton fought for, solidarity among working people across race and background. It's exactly what this country needs right now. Not billionaires separating us for profit, not culture wars meant to distract, but real coalition, workers recognizing our shared power. They need us. Remember, the truth always leaves a trail. If we follow it, question official narratives, and examine power critically, we don't just honor Hampton's legacy, we protect our own future. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this has been When Killers Get Caught. I leave you with one final question. What does it mean if the government decides someone is too dangerous to live? And what should we do about it?